Uh, Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And when Professor Carney invited me to talk at this seminar, I was more or less aware that he probably wanted me to do so as a student of Middle Eastern politics and Islamic culture. My first inclination, therefore, was to try to present the case that in the case of Islam and the Middle East, the generosity and kindness to strangers is also a much valued and much heralded virtue. And I thought I would give some examples of that. And indeed, one could find many passages in the Quran, the sacred book of Islam, and in the prophetic traditions that elevate this virtue of kindness and generosity towards strangers to a matter of religious duty. And I think anyone who has lived or worked in the Middle East could certainly attest to the great emphasis that is placed on these values at all levels of society. In the Iranian culture, with which I'm more familiar, in particular, the theme of hospitality to strangers is quite paramount. In fact, so much so that at times it could become almost overbearing. To give you but one example, albeit an unfortunate and a somewhat surrealistic one, I want to describe for you the encounter between one group of Americans and their Iranian hosts some 3 decades ago. One detail in this story, which makes it a bit different from the usual accounts of hospitality to strangers, is the fact that the group of Americans that I have in mind was not there voluntarily as guests of their Iranian hosts, but obviously I'm referring, by now you should have guessed, to the most unfortunate encounter between these two cultures in recent times, namely the takeover of the United States Embassy in Tehran back in November of 1979. Now, the story, which I have heard from 2 or 3 sources, including the one who is the main character in the story, goes back to a few months into their captivity, to the time of 2 or 3 months into their captivity, and a Christmas celebration that the hostage takers, the students who had climbed over the fences of the American embassy and had taken over the embassy, the Christmas party that they had thrown for the American hostages, if you will, their guests. At this particular ceremony, a number of influential people from the Iranian government were present, including apparently a high-ranking cleric. So one of the hostages, actually a good friend of mine by the name of John Limbert, who is a distinguished diplomat and not coincidentally a very distinguished student of Iranian literature and culture, he was chosen to speak on behalf of the hostages, over 50 of them at the time. And he said to this cleric that, you know, sir, Iranian hospitality is proverbial, and as a student of your culture, I'm very keenly aware of it. But I think in this case, you're really overdoing it. And of course, that brought a smile, but unfortunately, it did not bring a change in the attitude of the government, and the captivity of the Americans continued for some 14 months. Now, in preparing my brief comments for your seminar, I thought I would not focus on the positive side of the encounter with the stranger, or if you will, this self-other relationship, but on its dark side. More specifically, and to the point of my talk, what I would like to focus on is the casting of the other, the stranger, particularly the distant other, as evil. Perhaps of the many ways in which the other can be construed or characterized, it is the view of the other as evil that provokes the most intense feelings of fear, hatred, and gives us the license to mistreat the other, to wage war against him, and in the extreme, to eradicate him. What is inherent in this vicious logic of vilification of the other, or if you will, demonization of the other, and perhaps what accounts for its appeal in many different circumstances, historically and in our own times, is that through such a triumph of good over evil, we hope usually to seek and affirm our own sense of moral superiority and achieve greater communal solidarity. Furthermore, as I shall try to show, as in the course of my remarks, such demonization of the other can also have highly instrumental purposes, usually to advance particular ideological positions or political objectives. To a large extent, I think one could fairly say that this was the attitude that characterized President Bush's response to the tragedy of 9/11. And his often cited reference to the enemy as evil. This was clearly the moral and ideological framework within which the so-called war on terror was waged, and the prism through which we looked at the rest of the world during this period of our history. The former president had a truly Manichaean view of the world, and this was well summarized in many statements that he made in a particular address. This was only 2 or 3 months after the tragedy of 9/11. He said something like this, that this is truly a conflict between good and evil, and there really isn't much middle ground, like none. The people we fight are evil. Either you are with us or you're against us. Sadly, this view and the moral clarity with which the president held it extended well beyond the war on terror. And as one chronicler of the Bush presidency put it recently, more policies were justified, more government power expanded, more mischief enabled, and more perceptions manipulated by the Bush administration's involving concept of the enemy and the pure evil enemy than by any other tactic. But, and I think this is the key focus of my talk, President Bush was certainly not alone in projecting such a Manichaean worldview. In fact, well over a decade before he placed one of the main charter members of his so-called axis of evil, namely Iran, together with Iraq and North Korea, on that axis. The Iranian supreme leader, the leader of the 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, projected a very similar image to refer to the United States, using the famous phrase now to characterize the US, namely the great Satan. Now that phrase came to provide the framework within which the perceptions of the United States as a major world power and as the cause of all mischief for the next 2 or 3 decades were presented. And in this way, it became not only a slogan, but truly a way of perceiving and dealing with the West. The notion of evil and the great Satan indeed had some roots in the Iranian culture, but the meaning of evil up until that time, in the particularly in the religious, popular religious culture of Iran, was a sort of ethical notion that evil is a temptation that one should try to protect oneself against. Incidentally related to the Augustinian notion of evil as a temptation. Not as a great malevolent force in the globe or in the world, in the cosmos. Such a notion had existed in the pre-Islamic culture of Iran, in the Zoroastrian religion, and later in the Manichaean religion, to which indeed St. Augustine had great drawing and an affinity in his youth. And there, in Zoroastrian and Manichaean religions, indeed, evil was described, was understood as a force almost equal with the forces of good, the good God, and this was portrayed as a cosmic struggle ongoing in the course of cosmic history and certainly human history, in which we as humans are caught. So there were those resonances in the Iranian culture, the pre-Islamic culture, that Khomeini could draw from. Another source, however, for this notion of the US as great Satan was a much more contemporary view and line of thinking that had developed in the course of the revolution and indeed in the decades before that within the political sphere of the country. There were a number of Iranian intellectuals on the left who talked about the West in such terms, that is, in terms of an arrogant power, as a corrupting power, as a dominating power, and maligned Iranian culture and other intellectuals, if you will, the defenders of the status quo in those days, as those who had this disease of Westitis on a par with hepatitis or West toxification. They were toxified by the West and had given up or sold out their own authentic identity. This line of thinking, which was not within the religious sphere, but very much in the political sphere, was indeed quite dominant and one of the principal ideological bases of the 1979 revolution. The same theme, incidentally, is by no means unique to Iran. We see this in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in the so-called dependency theory, casting the US in the role of the imperial power, not so much malevolent, but exploitative and imperial power. We see it, for example, in the writings of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and this relentless conflict between the African and the European. So those ideas were also around, and Khomeini, in a sense, was building on those images and the power of those images within the political sphere. But the objective in characterizing the US as the Great Satan was clearly a political objective to which these religious dimensions and religious symbolism had been added. And one must say that he succeeded in propounding this idea, in making it a prevalent image in the Iranian culture, and a sort of guideline for the policies of the country, and this very conspiratorial view of the outsider, specifically of the West and the Great Satan, the United States, in the subsequent decades. He was able to elevate this phrase so much that the Oxford Dictionary indeed entered it as the second definition of evil after the more commonplace definition. So Great Satan, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, was given the definition that it refers, I'm now quoting, to the United States, viewed as an imperialistic and malevolent power, especially in the context of US policy in the Middle East. This was the handiwork of Khomeini. And we also have the novel by Salman Rushdie, The Satanic Verses, which in a sense was a response to this characterization of the West as the Great Satan. So, as I mentioned, the combination of the old religious resonances, Zoroastrian religion, Manichaean religion in the pre-Islamic culture, and the more contemporaneous political dimensions of evil, as described by these left-leaning intellectuals in Iran, they provided the basis for Khomeini's metaphor, the Great Satan. Now, in all fairness, one has to acknowledge that the United States policies, and before that, the British and the Russian policies, provided also a very objective and realistic ground for the feelings of antipathy and opposition to the US. We all know about and talk about the 1953 coup d'etat that was sponsored by the United States. And of course, Khomeini, in characterizing the US, would make reference to the 53 coup d'etat against what was then a democratic government in Iran, and various other misdeeds of the US in subsequent years after the revolution, including the siding with Saddam Hussein and the horrible war that was waged by Saddam Hussein initially, and then later continued by both Iran and Iraq for a period of almost a decade, and had hundreds of thousands of casualties, the bloodiest conflict in the post-war era. So my purpose, once again, is to warn us against the use of such powerful metaphors in casting the stranger, in casting the others, and the very real consequences that they have in the relationship between groups, between nations, and certainly between individuals from different cultures. And in my view, this religious and cultural dimension that has been given to the concept of evil, or the uses, I should say, that have been made of the concept of evil, are to a large extent responsible for what has been the most difficult foreign policy issue and foreign relation aspect for both the United States and Iran for the past 3 decades. I think I'll end on that note. Thank you.